welcome to Leaders of Tomorrow Season 10. I'm Sunanda Jayaseelan. On the show tonight, we have the CFO of Godrej Consumer Products joining us as he talks about the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war on domestic companies and industries, particularly in the FMCG space, his views as far as outlook for price increase and inflation is concerned over the next few months, and his advice for CFOs in an ever-changing environment. Listen. Sameer, thank you for your time here on the Leaders of Tomorrow. Good having you joining us to talk directly to our viewers about the top events which are impacting the life of any small business as we see it. And I'm of course talking about first the pandemic and recovery really coming back, but second also what we're seeing as far as the ripple effect that we're calling it here on the Leaders of Tomorrow of the Ukraine-Russia war. And it's good having you here joining us to talk about the bird's eye view as far as the FMCG space is concerned, Sameer.
Thanks, Ananda, for having me on the show. I think the role of CFO has evolved over the last 2 years. I think at the onset of pandemic, it was all about scenario building. It was about cash preservation. And then immediately to shift gears to growth because you no longer want to be beyond a point in time too much, kind of preserving cash. So the shift was from how do you preserve your cash to kind of get into growth mode. And over the last 6 to 8 months, it has been all about how do you tackle the inflationary pressures. Yeah. The inflation has been, going on since last, I would say 9 to 12 months. And I don't know to hazard a guess in terms of where this will, be over next months and quarters. Sure. But the role over here is to ensure that the price increases, which is being passed on to the end consumers, a calibrated one. Sure. Consumers beyond a point cannot absorb the entire increase in input cost. The other piece over here is to not panic, because there could be a tendency to kind of really get into a panic mode when you see wild swings, as we have been seeing actually 10% plus or 10% minus in terms of some of the key commodity basket, but just a little bit more calmer in terms of what's happening, have a point of view strategically in terms of where some of this could be, and then take your pricing action.
Absolutely, Sameer, and thanks for setting the stage for our entrepreneurs. Let's break it up. And I want to start by talking first about what is ongoing right now as far as the Ukraine-Russia crisis is concerned. And I want for you to really call out the biggest impact for an entrepreneur who's perhaps in the FMCG space. As the leader when it comes to this industry, how closely are you watching this event? What, according to you, is going to be the biggest impact really out of what's really going on right now?
So my advice for all the entrepreneurs who are going to watch this show would be to, one, continue with the entrepreneurial instinct. Don't get too bogged down in terms of all what is happening, because some of it will subside, some of it will come back to normative levels over a period of time. Unfortunately, what we are seeing is unprecedented inflation, not just in India, but also globally, which is definitely going to have an impact. What will be very important is to not lose sight in terms of the drivers to growth. That's going to be extremely critical, and hence a balance between how does one drive growth and how does one tackle some of these inflationary pressures is going to be very critical. I also feel that in very short term, if there is a trade-off between growth and profitability, entrepreneurs should not shy away from skewing more towards growth, because if there is growth, eventually there will be profitability, and if there is loss of growth, then profitability will be any which way is difficult to come in.
So I was just looking at news reports. In the past month, you've seen one of the highest input cost impact across FMCG majors, and for a small business that's watching today's interview. Just give us your strategy in terms of how you manage your raw material costs, because we're also coming off, perhaps the worst that we've seen as far as any of us are concerned when it comes to the pandemic. And I'm sure that businesses like yours faced some sort of raw material and input cost pressure and constraints. So how did you really manage that period, and your advice for managing any disruptions when it comes to raw material and managing input cost disruption?
There are multiple strategies, Sunanda, which one can follow. Typically, for some of the key raw materials or commodity-linked raw materials, one can have sourcing strategy, which can be either you kind of go long in terms of your purchases, if your in-house view is that the prices over a period of time are going to move up, or you remain extremely low in terms of your purchase or forward contracts on purchases if the view is that prices are going to come down. So that's the first thing which can be deployed. The other is being very dynamic and having a very deep-rooted relationship with the vendors. And that's very important, because in times like this, we can always go back to our vendors to kind of share, the pain, right, in terms of inflation. So part can be shared by the business and part can be shared by the vendors. The other thing which can also be factored in is how does one go even more, severe in terms of cost-saving programs. Now, those cost-saving programs can actually be either on raw materials, packaging materials, or even on so-called fixed overheads, which would be part of the business. So in times like this, it's also very important to be very frugal in terms of cost. And every cost which is not a consumer-facing cost should be questioned and should be challenged in tough times like this, so that it helps in offsetting some of the inflationary pressure.
Okay. How closely are you going to be watching what's happening as far as crude oil prices are concerned? Increasing sanctions on Russia. India, I think, is not going to be one of those nations, at least by the comments, so far. But if OPEC is to take any action, that's going to have a direct impact on countries like India. How are you seeing that situation panning out?
Crude largely is an indirect derivative for most of the businesses. So the impact of crude typically takes 3 to 6 months in the end raw material or packaging material, which any company would purchase. So my first advice would be to kind of upstock in terms of raw materials and packaging materials, because there is still a possibility of it being at relatively lower price. Today's crude prices is something which will get reflected maybe 3-6 months down the line. So that's one strategy which one can deploy. Parallelly build your scenarios in terms of what's the price increases which can be passed on to the end consumers. And again, it's about taking calibrated price increases and not a one-stroke price increase, because consumption could get impacted, as well as there could be a risk of you losing out on your market share. So that has to be a good balance between increase in input cost and increase in end consumer prices.
Sameer, we started this conversation where you spoke about a possible price increase and, passing that on really to consumers. So my question to you is there an outlook as far as pricing is concerned that you would want to give our viewers?
It has been the norm. If you look at the listed companies' results, Ananda, there has been price increase of anywhere between high single digits to double digits. And my view is for the sector, the price increase trends will continue at least for next 3 to 6 months. Because there always will be a lag between increase in end consumer price and increase in the input cost, because there would be inventory in the system, and also price increases will be calibrated in nature. So I see the quantum of price increases moving up over next 3 to 6 months. As I mentioned earlier, the price increases have to be calibrated once.
Okay. I want to talk a little about the role that innovation plays. I know, I'm speaking to a company that is highly innovative when it comes to the kind of products, etc., that you are offering. But for an entrepreneur, particularly in the industry that you are in, are you happy with the kind of innovation that you're seeing? Because, we're talking about, on one end, entrepreneurs are being squeezed as far as the raw material prices are concerned. And on the other end, things are still continuing to look a little uncertain, particularly for small businesses. So are you happy with the kind of innovation? What's your own approach to innovation at GCPL that you could use as advice for our small businesses?
Sure. No, innovation has been a lead growth driver for us, and some of the metrics, which are global metrics like innovation rate, for us hover around high teens to even 20%, which is a great innovation rate metric to track. I mean, my advice to the entrepreneurs would be to continue being innovative, because that's what will differentiate you. Eventually, the space is going to get crowded. So, what will be your USP and what will be differentiation, and that can come from innovation. Now, if we spend some time in terms of how does one drive innovation, it actually starts with having a very deep consumer engagement and insight. The moment you understand what are consumers' behavior, you understand what are some of the unmet consumer needs. And if you are able to understand it very clearly, you will be able to have a thought process in terms of what product or service can be offered to that consumer, which is currently not getting offered.
Sameer, I have to take a quick commercial break. On that note, we're back in just a moment. Welcome back. You're with us here on Leaders of Tomorrow, and tonight we're in conversation with the CFO of Godrej Consumer Products. Since we are talking about outlook, I want to ask you about consumer sentiment and consumer sentiment outlook. Things have definitely started picking up, particularly after the second and the third wave. But going forward into the rest of 2022, are you expecting sentiment will stay strong?
So unfortunately, it has been a little muted, Sunanda, right, over last 6 to 8 months. And our view is it may remain a little soft even going ahead. Typically, the consumer behavior is into three buckets, I would say. Firstly, when there is high inflationary environment, the consumers reduce down the pantry stocks in their houses.
Sure.
Even the channel partners will reduce down their stocks. The second phase is wherein consumer would start stretching the consumption or downtrade, because there is pressure on the wallet, and hence consumers would go for brands which are relatively value offering brands. And the third bucket is wherein consumer just stops on the consumption. That typically could happen for ultra discretionary categories, not for very basic staple categories. My sense is we are very much in the midst of anywhere between second and third bucket from a consumer behavior perspective. Difficult to call out, but at least in very short term, looks like the consumers will be, kind of pretty much tight in terms of their consumption. But hopefully, over a period of time, which could be 3-6 months down the line, with expected good monsoon, with agri inflation also going up, which is good from rural consumption perspective, we should see gradual recovery going ahead.
Okay, I want to talk about India's exports coming in very strong. For someone who's looking at the export markets, who is manufacturing perhaps in low cost destinations outside of India, near shore to India, what sort of strategy would you like them to have, particularly because there could be some sort of fallout of what's happening in Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, that could be a good opportunity actually for some of the businesses who have higher exports. And it's not just Russia and Ukraine. Russia-Ukraine crisis also unfortunately has had impact on a lot of other countries, which could be export hub for many other countries. So exports can, potentially scale up from India. So one needs to be, pretty much up there in terms of what are the potential growth opportunities, existing countries in terms of share of business, as well as new countries to begin with.
Sure.
Only other caution which I would like to throw, especially on exports, is the commercial risk, because the global economy is also going through a very tough phase.
Yeah.
So when you are having exports, just ensure that your advances are up there. Eventually, you don't want to face any credit risk, but otherwise, exports could be a big opportunity for a country like India. And anyways, India has its own advantage in terms of being a relatively low cost manufacturer globally.
Since we're calling out trends, Sameer, I'd love for you to also be able to talk to our entrepreneurs in the FMCG space. Any specific verticals, if I can call it that, as a big opportunity you would like to call out for our entrepreneurs? I know during the pandemic, anything related to safety, hand sanitizers, masks, etc., manufacturing of that had really started picking up. But going forward into 2022, any specific verticals that you think will be interesting for entrepreneurs to keep their eyes on?
I think in terms of categories, I mean, there would be some categories which will have tailwind. There would be some categories which will have headwinds. Like in pandemic, we did see hygiene category, I mean, blossoming. But now it's normalizing at pre-COVID level, maybe a little better off than pre-COVID level. So there could be some opportunistic play also. The piece I think which is gathering a lot of momentum is the digital world, especially in terms of reaching out to the consumers. So a lot of entrepreneurs, if they have disruptive products as well as if they have competitive products, no longer should be worrying about how they will reach out to the end consumers, because today you have the flexibility of leveraging most of these digital platforms, which just takes care of your logistics as well as cost to serve eventually for reaching to the consumers. And it's also a very quick way of launching your products, calling out your USPs, as well as getting good consumer feedback. So that's definitely one big trend which I am observing. And again, on those platforms, you can go with mix of both disruptive products as well as competitive products.
Sameer, we're also talking to you at a time when we've just seen the start of the new fiscal. The role of the CFO has definitely been changing, particularly for small businesses, where you very often see the CEO founder also playing the role of the CFO. How have things changed post the pandemic in terms of just all the things that a CFO needs to look at? The role of a CFO, how has it changed?
Well, my expectation would be that CFO's role should be such that in CEO's absence, I mean, CFO is able to run the business. So those are all the ingredients which I would definitely want to, kind of look into the potential CFOs. I think the change has to be in terms of having a strong growth mindset. I mean, most of the CFOs, I'm sure, would be very much equipped with functional knowledge and also what's happening in the world of regulations, what's happening in the world of macros and economics, and hence treasury, but having that deep understanding of the business. And my advice also would be to kind of spend more time in the back end, whether it be manufacturing, spend more time in the front end, and keep a very close watch on what's happening in the world of regulations. So one needs to be very much on the ball in terms of what regulatory changes are happening, bring that piece into the business strategy refresh, growth strategies and discussions internally. And largely I would suggest CFO should be focusing on three things, and that's very integral to the CFOs. First is business partnering or co-piloting the CEOs of the business. The second one is on governance, and we call this as growth and governance actually. And the third is, leadership, management, and communication, because in today's world, it's very important to kind of groom leaders of the future, as well as have very effective and strong communication on a continuous basis.
Fantastic. As I'm ending today's interview, just one more thing. Any advice you'd want to leave our entrepreneurs with? You just spoke about the three things that they should keep their eye on, but perhaps something that you would want to advise them on as we're ending today's interview.
Well, I mean, if you look at the entrepreneurs and if you look at the unicorns and decacorns now, I mean, the list is long. So I'm sure, many of them have done extraordinarily well, and many actually will be the next, unicorns and decacorns going ahead. It's a tough job. I mean, what I understand at least, and hence don't give up in terms of all what you are doing. Think of scale eventually. Think of also sustainable model. Initial model could be different, could be more of seeding, which comes at the cost of, say, profitability. But eventually it has to be a sustainable model, because you cannot build an empire for next 50 years without having, sustainable business model. So that's one. And basically be agile in terms of shift in strategies. The other piece is be more outward rather than being inward, because in today's world, you can actually, get a lot of ideas, crowdsourcing, you can get a lot of support, and not just from a funding perspective, but generally business ideas and support. If you just kind of knock many doors. So just be more outward. So yeah, these are the advices which I would want to share to the entrepreneurs, and I'm sure they will be the next unicorns and decacorns in future.
Sameer, I do need to ask you a question as far as the distribution chain is concerned. You were talking to us about your vendor partners. A conversation that we've been having here with logistics players is that there's a definite impact on domestic logistics players because of what's happening as far as the Ukraine-Russia war is concerned. How are you seeing the distribution network perhaps being impacted for FMCG because of the war, and how should an entrepreneur plan for that?
Yeah, I mean, what one can evaluate is revisiting the entire manufacturing footprint, because especially in FMCG, you would have, say, X number of plants across the country, and your customers or consumers eventually could be in very different part of the country. So once you revisit your manufacturing footprint, you can actually try to marry in where your manufacturing units are to where your consumer base is. That's one thing which can be done. The other is try to be more direct. I mean, there is a lot of layering, I would say, in FMCG sector, where you have a manufacturing unit, you have warehouses, you have carrying and forwarding agents, and then you eventually have distributors. So how do you delayer and get more direct, actually, either to carrying and forwarding agents, or even evaluate some of the online channel partners in terms of reaching out directly to the consumers. What we do, especially on logistics, and to basically mitigate some of the inflationary challenges, is do reverse auctioning for our logistics contracts with a lot of logistics service providers, which turns out to be much more commercially viable as compared to keeping the contracts open. So that at least in inflationary times like this reduces down the cost relatively.
Sameer, thank you so much for speaking to us on all of these trends and the events which are impacting the life of entrepreneurs going forward. It's been a good conversation with you here on the show. Out of time on tonight's interview, but if you have any feedback for us, our contact details on your screens as we speak. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.